Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Brittany Higginbotham, and I'm the Communications and Digital Specialist for the Institute for Public Relations. I know everyone's sort of just coming all in at once and getting situated, so I'm going to keep my portion brief. A few housekeeping notes. So this is being recorded and will be available for playback within 24 hours on our website and YouTube channel. We encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A box. We are going to have a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. And please share comments and resources in the chat box. If you have any tech issues, just let me or any IPR staff member know and we will help resolve. Quickly, I wanted to just quickly introduce our panelists. We have Deidre Campbell. She's an IPR trustee who has been a leader in Edelman's financial services business for 10 years and is now managing director in Edelman Smithfield. We also have Lex Savanto, Global CEO of Edelman Smithfield. And then last but not least, Jamie Fish, EVP of Employee Experience at Edelman. But I'm going to hand it over to Deidre to kick things off.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see such a great crowd showing up. We think we're bringing you a presentation that is really about employee trust and employee culture and how this is increasingly on the mind of the board, and talk about sort of what's important for communicators to know and how to really use this as an opportunity. I would like to, with that, introduce my colleagues, Lex Savanto. Let me just move the slides here. Lex is managing partner and global CEO of Edelman Smithfield, and Jamie Fish, executive vice president of employee experience. And in the next hour with you, we will be drawing from data from the Edelman Trust Barometer, which many of you will be familiar with. But please be thinking about your questions and drop them in the QA, because we will definitely be saving time at the end of this presentation for some good questions from the crowd. So with that, I turn it over to you, Lex.
Hi, everybody. I fear that picture that was taken many years ago doesn't really look like me anymore, but here we are. Nice talking with everybody. This is a really important moment because the trends are changing quickly in the boardroom. Their prioritization and focus on workforce, on culture, on employees has been rising significantly and quickly over the last few years for a variety of reasons. We will go through that, but this creates a really important opportunity for people in this audience, for communications professionals, in terms of the role that you play with the board, in terms of the resource and the expertise that you can provide to the board. So we're hoping to educate you on those trends, quickly provide updates based on the Edelman Trust Barometer that are specific to this area, and then talk about what the board is doing and what you can do to help. So let's dive in. Next slide. So key takeaway number one, the board aperture is quickly widening to include much more focus on employee audiences. Next slide. A quick look at what a conventional board agenda looks like. This is not necessarily the board agenda today, but if you look down the left side of this slide, review of last meeting's protocol, performance reports, annual general meeting, annual accounts, auditor's review, legal regulatory compliance, strategy, market competitiveness, investment proposals, some talent, risk. This is the conventional agenda. And it's a pretty structured agenda. Most boards follow this kind of structured approach. But as you'll see, culture is not on here. Talent quality review historically was very focused on the C-suite, the CEO in particular. And the conventional agenda didn't make a lot of room for the topics that we're about to discuss. This is changing quickly, and in many boardrooms has already changed significantly. Let's go to the next slide. This is a screenshot. It's meant to be blurry. You can see the heads of people in the audience. It's a screenshot from a presentation just last month at the National Association for Corporate Directors, the biggest gathering of public company and private company directors. And you can see it's a word cloud of what do you believe is the top blind spot? Right in the middle, the biggest word is culture. So for communicators in this audience that wondered, does the board care? Are they focused on this? Should I talk to them about this? It's right there, the biggest blind spot. Next slide. What's driving the increased focus? I think we all know some of these: the Great Resignation, workforce issues, burnout during COVID, the strikes that we recently saw, not only in Hollywood, but with the automakers. Interestingly, boards are starting to add CHRO on the middle right. Boards are starting to add capability in terms of people with human resources expertise. But then also another interesting thing is happening if you look at the bottom two. Boards themselves are being scrutinized for their own culture and their own reputation, and how they are supporting or not supporting, where liabilities are emerging in terms of the board's knowledge and interaction with the employee workforce. You can see in the bottom right, we probably all read about the Southwest issues that happened not too long ago, and this headline directly highlighting the board's role. Next slide. So the board is more and more focused on workforce, on employee trust, on culture. At the same time, though, and for those of you who are familiar with the trust barometer, you'll know that employees are looking to their own employer more than ever, trusting their own employer more than ever, and their expectations of their employer are also rising in many new ways. Jamie?
Thank you, Lex. Good morning, everyone. So we can jump to the next slide, which really is a beautiful graphic in that it both helps us to sort of constellate the forces of trust at play across some of these organizations, business, NGOs, government, media. But what's really interesting is that you see the sort of lower lighter gray triangle, which is really where all of these sort of organizations were falling in 2020. And to the right, you see the sort of green line that's indicating the trend line of all of these organizations sort of moving up collectively. And this increased trust in business really as the most ethical and the most competent across all of these sources of information. So when we look at the dimensions of trust, competence and agility and ethics and expectations to do the right thing are really the factors that are implicated here. And you'll see that the businesses have really surged in that expectation based on the trust that people are placing in them. And that's a 19-point rise, which for us sort of data heads is quite significant over the last couple of years. We can look at the next slide, please. And we really see this kind of connecting, as Lex said, to employer media being the most believable. My employer is top amongst sort of trusted sources of communication. And that's a large segment, well over half, meaning people trust their employer news channels more than mainstream media and more than other media sources, which is significant and quite new over the last few years. So something that we're seeing, again, sort of trending up and tracking closely. And I want you to also start to think about how this is sort of implicated in the board's mind as they're tracking to culture. So for the next slide, we'll see that, those credible voices within my employer, my organization, we sort of dissected them and broken them down a little bit more across how people are sort of aligning that within their organization. So people like myself, company experts, academic experts, those are the top three of really sort of rated extremely credible sources of information within the organization. Again, really connecting to that sort of localized trust within my company.
A side note, and
yeah.
just to add on to that, if you look at board of directors, one of the lower bars on the right, as communicators, you can help play a role in helping the boards understand what their reputation is among employees. with this in mind.
That's exactly right, Lex. And when we're looking at the data that we see here, that delta between, sort of 47%, really trusting the board of directors versus 72% trusting a person like themselves within the organization, that delta is the divide that is the opportunity space here, and really where the board is going to need support from communicators. Next slide, we'll kind of connect a little bit more deeply into the employee expectation around social issues and culture, and just really sort of map the edges on why the stakes are quite high here in that employer-employee compact. The next slide will show that sort of, we feel this, our research has shown that the purchase funnel is collapsing. People are constantly interrogating their relationships to brands, and they're very willing to apply pressure to businesses to stand up for them. So, we like to think of that increased trust that's moved disproportionately or sort of proportionately away from other organizations into business. And with that trust is this big expectation for businesses to stand up for people's beliefs. And we see that in how people are casting their vote with their dollars, how they're casting their vote with their allegiances, how they're casting their vote with their advocacy. And the numbers here really are quite high. People are buying or advocating for brands based on shared belief and values at 63%, which is quite significant. And then really in terms of sort of board level awareness of workforce and how we're mitigating sort of material impact of workforce and enterprise initiatives, is that the workforce is expecting companies to have a societal impact. They're considering that when they're taking a job and throughout their sort of tenure with an organization in terms of how they're showing up and feeling that they're being met by their employer. The next slide will sort of, continues to kind of highlight this concept, and that's not something that's remained consistent or sort of a trend we're seeing that's kind of an outlier in the data. This is really bundled with the concept that it's not less engagement, it's more, and it keeps increasing. The data point to really sort of focus on here is that we see across all of these issues that matter most to people, the uptick is, significantly sort of at the median 5.5% year over year. And that means that pressure is not letting up. We're looking for that ongoing consistent engagement. And, people are really 6 times more likely to say that businesses aren't doing enough, that they could be frankly doing more. And so that's the expectation. And when we're thinking about board level awareness of your employees as a stakeholder group, that really adds quite a lot of significance and gravitas to the risk assessment. Next slide. We've identified that boards are thinking about culture, recognizing it as a potential blind spot, and that the stakes are quite high there. And so we sort of look at this across this concept of how we're trending from the inside in organizations. So what people are looking for: career advancement, 83%, up 2 points from last year; personal empowerment, 80%, up 2 points from last year; societal impact, 71%. So that's a very sort of multi-dimensional expectation of my employer as compared to really just comp and benefits that we might have seen in years past. And we want to make sure that the board has the tools and the awareness and the sort of measurable sort of ways to track over time how this sort of expectation can have a material impact on the organization. And it's complicated, more complicated than ever. Next slide, please. Employees also believe that they can really pressure organizations to change. Half believe this, and that is growing. We see that it's trending up 5 points since last year. And we also see, and we'll look at this in further slides, that Gen Z is having quite an impact on other generations in the workforce in, again, sort of positively influencing that trend to increase. So you'll see here sort of within the age groups, we've got Gen Z at about 54%, millennials at 54%, Gen X at 48%. And then sort of boomers are at 40%, but that's again, sort of these are increasing incrementally year over year. And you see that the broader increase, meaning up 7 points in sort of the Generation X and boomer generation, that's showing the sort of increased impact from Gen Z as a part of the workforce. The
Jamie,
next slide.
This one is both this slide and the one that you just clicked to are particularly interesting because boards, as we said, are increasingly focused on workforce, culture, employees. But these stats showing that employees increasingly think they can pressure the organization for change, driven, I think this slide by Gen Z, that's an interesting tension. So boards want to get more involved. They want to understand what employees are thinking and expecting and how they're behaving and how they're performing. But employees at the same time are starting to realize, wait a minute, I have a voice and I can pressure change. So that creates an interesting tension that communications leaders will play an essential role in understanding that tension and where the risks play out.
That's exactly right. And they're not only influencing the willingness to pressure organizations, they're also influencing how we voice our concerns. So being vocal, wanting to sort of have access directly to the C-suite and voice concerns and provide feedback. And in many cases, motioning for petition to sort of have representation through union and labor organizations. And that's really shifting the dynamic of how representation is perceived and what it means in terms of this sort of broader landscape of the areas that matter to me most and the expectation I have of my employer to really have a significant, representation of my values in the broader governance and activities of the organization. And then this next slide really, I mean, it is the opportunity space, but it's also why this is a risk. So knowing all of that, there's expectation, there's this increased pressure, this sort of willingness to engage in new channels, to work collectively to sort of pressure organizations to sort of really cast our vote across a variety of platforms that we have and gain new platforms that will have a material impact. Across all of that, we're seeing that people are also really experiencing that the infrastructure just isn't in place yet to meet that ask. The expectations that we've identified are falling quite short of reality, 16 and 17 points, just significant. Both in ease of contributing input, feeling sort of heard within the organization, and also employees feeling that they have an opportunity to be included in strategic planning processes. That's quite significant. And again, is the place where there's a lot of potential sort of noise and risk in the system, but also really where we would want to sort of hit the ground running as the opportunity space as communicators and say, this is something we can measure over time. How are we meeting the expectations and delivering on that promise to our employee stakeholders?
This slide shows another interesting tension. Boards want more information. They want to measure more about the workforce and what's the state of employees. But employees are saying, you're not even giving me enough room, enough ability to give my input. So again, a role that communications leaders have to play in making sure that the information that gets to the board reflects the true input that employees want to provide.
And many boards are very much still in the awareness phase and sort of moving into that owning and action as sort of follow-ups of how we can sort of build on this awareness and take action and sort of begin to shift the expectation being a little bit more aligned with the reality. And again, I know I keep saying it, but it's kind of an exciting opportunity space for communicators to support in that shifting from awareness into owning and action through the many tools that we use and to be sort of a voice in the room at board level. And I think this is a nice way to seg back to you, Lex, in terms of talking about the role that communication leaders can play. And I feel we've, talked quite a bit about how it's more important than ever. And so starting to kind of look at ways that we can begin to meet that that opportunity space.
Great. So let's pivot into actions that communicators can think about regarding this topic. We can flip to the next slide. So again, the one of the audiences that boards are motivated most by, of course, there's a lot of debate about this itself, is investors. And of course, regulators also. Gary Gensler, the head of the SEC, he sent this tweet actually a few years ago saying investors want to better understand one of the most critical assets of a company, its people. And they are evaluating recommendations and potentially also issuing recommendations themselves for how public companies should think about this. So while the board is understanding that employee trends are changing, investors are also asking them for updates. And the SEC, the regulator, is also encouraging boards to think more about this topic, underscoring the importance of this and why boards are quickly ramping up. Next slide. So it's no surprise. This is a graph on the left of the percentage of directors in the Russell 3000 index that have CHRO, human resources experience, on the left. You can see the graph is going up. That's good, from 20 to 22. But you can also see that the overall amount is still small. It's going from 0.6% of total directors to 0.9, just less than 1% of total directors. But even still, it's clearly a trend. Boards are thinking more about how they can bring expertise onto the board that understands talent, that understands workforce. And on the right side, you can see some of the ways that boards are starting to integrate this into their own work. They're starting to align executive comp metrics with culture, with workforce metrics. They're starting to evaluate how the C-suite is modeling desired behaviors. Again, think about your own role as a communicator. You have a bird's eye view into the C-suite. You're part of the C-suite. And the question is whether you think the C-suite is modeling the employee and culture behaviors that the board thinks it should be modeling. The board, they're starting to evaluate how culture is communicated and how it can be measured. They're starting to think about culture and workforce leadership as part of CEO succession planning. And interestingly, they're also starting to think about the board's own culture. This is now a rapidly increasing focus for boards also, is what's the culture of the board? And is it facilitating success or an obstacle to it? Next slide. So what are some ways that communicators can engage in this increasingly important topic? I'll go through some of these ideas and then add a few more. First, ensure clear articulation of culture and how it aligns with purpose and strategy. Is there an articulation of it if the board were to ask about it? Ensure a clear articulation of employee sentiment and how it's measured for the board. Number two, try to map that to business KPIs. Number three, think about how this is communicated to the company. It's easy enough for people in the C-suite to come up with a strategic plan and have objectives and tactics and strategies. Question is it formally communicated? And if the board were to ask, okay, how is this communicated? Do you have an answer? Again, clear measurement. After that, be an advocate for workforce issues, including culture, to be a topic on the board's agenda. You can ask the corporate secretary, the general counsel, or whoever is the primary liaison with the board, are these topics on the agenda? And to what extent? How deep do they go? How often? Second to last point, understand that the culture in the C-suite and the board itself can be an obstacle. And being someone who's looking at that and providing input to that can be valuable. And then, of course, providing helpful education. One thing that I see that often helps is peer benchmarking. Look at what our peers are doing in this regard. Sometimes you can see this in their ESG reports. Sometimes you can get inside information as to what they're doing about workforce measurement, assessment, culture communication, culture measurement, culture of the C-suite, culture of the board, and pass that along. I'll add a couple of other tidbits before we stop for Q&A. In the 2022 annual meeting cycle, investors accelerated their call to action on workforce issues. There was 155 shareholder proposals of public companies on human capital, and that was up from 136 in 2021. So that fact boards are seeing, and that is one of the reasons why boards are becoming much more focused on this. Another fact, as we saw from the number of CHRO people with expertise on the board is growing, boards are looking to bolster their oversight of workforce issues, talent, and culture. So the question is what does that mean for us as communicators? It definitely means we need to be more involved. We need to be helping the board think about these issues. If we're not, then you'll be put at a disadvantage in terms of how the board thinks about its oversight of talent in the company. That's a critical point. The board is looking to bolster its oversight, and if you don't play a role in how they're thinking about that, then you may not play a role in how they execute it. And then lastly, boards, as we all know, boards have committees that they organize themselves around to focus on priority topics, and they are actively expanding committee roles. Could be the governance committee, could be the compensation committee, to have greater oversight over talent issues. And again, those changes may have already been made, and it's important for you to know which committee is involved, or there may be active thought process about how they're going to do that, and you may be able to play a role in how they evaluate that and determine that. So Deidre, I think we're now pivoting over to open discussion about this topic.
Great. Thank you, Lex. Really appreciate you and Jamie giving us that data. We'll start with a couple Q&As. We see some questions in the chat, but we will start with a couple here on this end. So Lex and Jamie, let's start with Jamie. We're talking about the importance of communicators getting into the room, having a seat at the table in terms of what issues do you think matter most to boards as it relates to employees and culture? Well, how do you think they're thinking about that today?
I think the way that we're seeing it currently is really sort of in the material impact. So how is it obviously impacting governance, license to operate, sort of really the bottom line in terms of enterprise strategy and initiatives? I think the role that a communicator can play is to support boards in also understanding other matters that, other social issues that matter most to the workforce. We see that people care quite a lot about climate change, economic inequalities, sort of access to healthcare and trustworthy information. So these are all facets that sort of really play into the employee expectation of their employer. And it's something that I think can be risen to the awareness of the board as something that they can speak more broadly to and really incorporate employee feedback into as well.
I'll add to that. Some of the slides that Jamie went through earlier, helping boards understand the expectations of employees. So there's an educational element there. Number two, Jamie talked about how employees increasingly believe that they have the ability to force change in companies. Boards need to understand what that is, what that means, what the implications of that might be. Just look at the Hollywood and Detroit labor union strikes recently. Those are big issues, and they have a significant financial impact on company financial results. But there are early warning signs or early indicators and education that boards can benefit from that might help boards take more proactive action to avoid those deeper impacts. The other thing we talked about, culture. Culture is something everyone talks about, but is there a way to measure it? Is there a way to communicate it? How should the board think about it? What is the ideal culture for your company? And helping the board understand what your goals are in that regard, how it's being communicated, and helping them see how it is progressing over time.
Jamie, Lex mentioned measurement there. So can you give us a sense of, sort of as communicators, what the range of tools that are available to us today and sort of what's coming in terms of smart measurement, and which enables us to play progress back to the board and to also sort of show gaps where work needs to be done?
Certainly. I know we showed in the slides that we can sort of measure people's sort of how they sort of feel that their social issues are being addressed within the organization and start to sort of straddle that divide. We also sort of, there is a wide range of measurement tools ranging from the really traditional, which is engagement and wanting to understand where employees are sort of accessing information, and how they can we can better tune to those channels in ways that they would like to be communicated with and feel heard and seen. Through to sort of much more sophisticated channels we're seeing now, we're able to use, machine learning and track sort of natural language processing over time that helps us to better understand in depth what matters to people, how they're sort of the behaviors and beliefs that are sort of showing up conversationally with employees, and giving them an opportunity to really kind of be addressed, not by sort of demographics alone, but really and the forces that sort of matter most to them, sort of in terms of their larger sort of value set. So there's quite a lot of a range of tools. Many are already sort of embedded in communication systems at organizations, and certainly there's new technology and tools that can be brought in. I think the main takeaway here is cue listening. Let employees know that we want to hear from them, and that their voice will be sort of brought up to board level, that we want them to sort of feel represented in the conversation. And the way that we signify that with employees is to really respond quickly in areas where we can take action. So speed in action, making changes based on what we're hearing quickly is a really impeccable way to start to sort of cue that listening and sort of broaden that feedback loop and provide greater opportunities for employees to weigh in.
Great, thank you. So one more from me, and then we'll go to the chat, because it looks like we're getting a lot of good questions in the QA and the chat itself. But Lex, for you, boards and CEOs are really carefully navigating this polarized world that we live in. What are you seeing in terms of risk factors that the board is dealing with as they try to, carefully kind of walk the straight and narrow while also speaking out on issues that align or don't align to their values?
Yeah, this is a very timely question. I'm sure everyone in the audience has seen some of this themselves. But what I'm seeing in helping boards manage some of these issues is, first of all, it's very difficult. But second of all, different people on the board will have different points of view. Everyone comes from their own heritage and history and background, and everyone brings their own perspectives to some of these issues. So what I'm seeing some very challenging and difficult debates in the boardroom over some of these polarizing issues. And it's really challenging the board in new ways. When you're talking about finance, it's one thing, or legal risk is another, or an auditor's opinion of your financial results. Those are all one kind of discussion. But when you're talking about whether a company should engage or allow its CEO to speak out, or how to deal with major issues that are highly polarized, we're seeing a lot of discord among board members. And in terms of how we're helping them navigate this, the first issue is just navigating it in the boardroom itself. Never mind navigating it among your employees or the broader audience. What we're finding is it's helpful for everyone to understand the context. It's helpful to understand what's happening in the outside world, what's happening with peer companies. It's helpful to very carefully track just how much steam is the issue getting. There's a lot of people that are very focused on certain issues, but the amount of pickup in the outside world may or may not match the focus on the issue. We're also seeing that education around the specifics of these issues helps bring board members and helps them understand different points of view. And we're also seeing that creating a venue for board members to talk openly about their point of view with each other, so that even they can understand the diverse perspectives in the boardroom, because of course they respect one another as fellow board members, but understanding each other's diverse perspectives in that boardroom is also powerful and helpful. But yes, it's a difficult issue and it's very fast moving. That's one other thing that we've seen help boards manage these issues, is for them to understand that they're very fast moving by definition. So what appears to be right or wrong at one particular moment may change, or at least the perceptions of that may change quickly. Deidre, back to you.
Right. So Jamie, I'm going to come back to you on this measurement issue. I mean, Lex just talked about how quickly the dynamics can change. And we have a question from a participant saying, we so often see that companies are measuring culture through the annual engagement surveys, maybe a few pulse surveys, right? And feel like they'll do we got good numbers back, we heard you, they'll put out an announcement or two, and then this feeling by the employee base that nothing really changed. How are you advocating to clients to go beyond these types of surveys to measure effectiveness?
We're seeing employee resource groups being utilized quite a lot. These are groups that are sort of formed by employees to support and really self-governed and designed, working really closely with those types of groups that have an opportunity to be working autonomously and then sharing sort of aggregated thinking through to the employer is a much more sort of immediate call and response. I think also, there's some survey fatigue in terms of the annual survey. And I think really the question there is, how do we as communicators sort of revisit those surveys to make them sort of more rich and more robust in terms of drilling down on the specifics that we're looking for. I agree that the worst case scenario is to send out a survey, get really clear reactions and not really action on it. So how can we assign more rigor around that process, respond quite quickly, take action that earns trust over time? So certainly employee resource groups specific to topics that are charged for people and that where they're looking to feel more seen and heard in the setting, creating more open forum opportunities, conversational and sort of otherwise in person or digital, but where the conversation is happening in real time are wonderful opportunities. And then really revisiting that sort of employee value proposition. What are we promising employees in exchange for their hard work and commitment to the organization? How are we earning that trust daily, and understanding that in relationship to our mission, our vision, and our values, and connecting those principles through all of our action and activities. That's sort of the filter through which we should be pressing considerations around how we're meeting people and serving them in the organization in return. So those are a few things. And again, I guess sort of the technological components were sort of meaning the tech is really sort of meeting that ask, is again to sort of have other resources beyond surveys where we're giving employees opportunities to kind of weigh in real time, and kind of removing a little bit of that survey fatigue. So the quick pulse checks and quick questions throughout the year and the weeks and the months across culture initiatives and change initiatives really supports people and feeling like they have an opportunity to weigh in at many different sort of touch points throughout their engagement.
Great, thank you. So kind of I'll go with the tougher question now and give both of you a chance on this. But I loved, Lex, that you talked about communicators as being culture champions. But in an economic environment that sort of undulates between, feel good, we are family, and then economic falters and it's layoffs and job cuts and people feeling like culture is just kind of an overused, poorly rolled out initiative, how should communicators be dealing with the undulating dynamics of culture and economic cycles?
Definitely map it. Couple thoughts. One is map it to KPIs. Make sure it's clearly defined. What is it? And that's a communications leader's role. Is there a clear articulation of the culture that you believe will benefit the company and its stakeholders? Number one. Number two, is that articulation mapped in some way to strategy and to business? Those two things alone are critical in making sure that there's continued conviction and commitment to that work. The other thing I would say is I work with a number of companies that have clear principles and strategy around workforce and talent. And despite economic ups and downs, it's fundamental to their strategy. But I'm sure that at those companies, the communications leaders played a role in creating that conviction and long-term commitment at the company.
Great. Here's sort of an elephant in the room, and I'll send this one back to you, Lex. Just that boards are seeing cases where companies and even other companies, I suppose, have acquiesced to employee directives only to be pushed back by certain groups of consumers. How are you consulting or counseling clients on that type of dynamic and kind of actions that could receive consumer pushback?
In some of these cases, I'll provide some thoughts. Jamie, you may want to add in. In some of these cases, we're finding that the original decision to act that employees are now pushing back on, that decision was made quickly and was not made based on principles or based on adequate input from the right stakeholders to be fully informed. So we're seeing boards, companies, and situations where employees are pushing back on a decision that they made. But the problem is when we ask, well, how was that decision made? Or what was the framework, the thought process in coming to that decision? There isn't a good answer. So the first recommendation is make sure that decisions that are being made along these lines on sensitive issues are based on, we've all heard this, based on purpose, based on philosophy. But you can see from these examples where decisions were quickly made that were not based on those. You can see how important that is, number one. Number two, really understanding what your stakeholder point of view is. And that comes back to the measurement idea. That comes back to having closeness and proximity and an avenue for understanding for the board and the leadership team what stakeholders are thinking and feeling. And again, that's a role, that's an ongoing, continuous role that communicators need to play with the C-suite and the board so that they're kept up to date on what the state of mind is of employees. And then lastly, these issues, as we mentioned before, are so fast moving. Patience and patience is a critical part of making the right decision, because a decision that you make one day, the next day may seem wrong. So having a bias towards not a lot of time, because we know that failure to act can also create a different issue, but at least being cognizant of evolving realities in the world can help a board and a management team make a decision that will last.
Yeah, I would add, just really to sort of reinforce this concept of considering action and governance and policy that's already in place, not sort of reactively making a statement or sort of, claiming a position based on sort of feeling sort of reactionary, or that there's a lot of noise in the field, but really sort of connecting it always back to existing policy action that's in place, in order to make sure that it sort of lives squarely within how we're living that truth as an organization. Now, if that's something that it needs to change over time, then again, sort of taking action in policy and governance that we can sort of measure the impact of and later speak more openly to, that really is kind of an approach to sort of progressively modifying based on what we're hearing from key audiences, without just sort of making a statement to make a statement, or making a statement that's not in alignment with the values of the organization as they're manifesting through governance and through activity.
I'll add, these issues that we're seeing and the struggles that companies are facing, and boards too, this requires a new kind of leadership. Mm-hmm. And it's not necessarily the leadership of the CEO when a company is facing these issues. And how do you make a decision? How do you choose between two impossible outcomes? And it requires a new kind of leadership that involves a vision for where things are going. It involves a deep understanding of what stakeholders are thinking, but it also involves a real core understanding of purpose and philosophy, and how to link purpose and philosophy with a decision about a single issue. That is a role that communicators are equipped better than most to contribute to. Just as we saw that graph where boards are bringing more CHROs onto the board because of the increasing focus on talent, this increasing focus on reputational risk is likely to cause boards to want to have more capability from reputation strategists. That's all of you. That's all of us. So it's really important to think about your role, but also make sure you're equipped, that vision, understanding stakeholders, and then having a philosophy, a practical, applicable philosophy of how to connect purpose and philosophy to decisions about these social issues. That's a highly valued skill set right now. That's a skill set that this group, this audience needs to have.
Jamie, so Lex spoke about new leadership. He spoke about communicators as reputation strategists. A really practical question that I think would be enlightening to this group is, what do you see as best practice in terms of the relationship between communications and HR, and like swim lanes, and how they come together for best outcomes for boards and for companies?
I love this question, because really, truly, the magic happens when HR and communications, marketing get in the room together and have these conversations. and really sort of constellate the efforts and beliefs and initiatives. One of the things that we see happening quite a lot is, that sort of cross-functional awareness and aligning on design principles. So what are the ways that we sort of meet the need state, and how can we sort of create connectivity across those, and sort of economies of scale and how we're focusing our initiatives. And I do think that requires some change in sort of operating model and ways of working within organizations, where they're looking to create that sort of connective tissue across those divisions, and be really mindful about not missing a single opportunity to sort of work cross-functionally and connected. This is, spans across the really so many opportunities of sharing data and how we're sort of aggregating our dashboards of insights on employees and audiences that are sort of critical to sort of the employee perspective. It also can really show up in, again, sort of those combined communications that are really sort of thoughtfully connecting all of the ways that we sort of touch in with employees and provide them with a holistic experience, acknowledging sort of wellness and health as sort of components of their employee experience is something that shouldn't just sort of live with HR. And, in the similar way, engaging employee audiences as advocates and first line of influence for organizations really can happen at a sort of marketing grade communication level. And that's an opportunity for communicators and marketers to partner together as well. So we're seeing really organizations that are doing it well are combining, aggregating that data, combining efforts in how they're connecting to employee audiences across their channels, and then really using the sort of native intelligence of best practices across and knowledge sharing and learning from one another in ways that make the employee experience quite holistic.
Great, thank you. So one of the things that I love about IPR is that it reaches sort of the communicators of today, but also the communicators of tomorrow. And I see we have lots of students and teachers on. I love this question from a PR and communication strategy teacher at Texas Tech. How can I best provide my undergraduates for these kinds of challenges? Who wants to take that? There you go, Lex.
Yeah, no, I think case studies, I'm sure you are already doing this, but the real world case studies and perhaps bringing people in that can bring them to life, and the dynamics that played out in a boardroom, of course, it can be, unbranded so that you don't reveal secrets. But it's one thing to see these issues from the outside. It's another thing to experience the debate and the struggle, the agony. Agony is what I'm seeing in boardrooms over how to make the right decision on some of these issues. They're agonizing over the choice. And that can only be brought to life for students, probably with inside perspective. So that would be one recommendation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had a similar thought in, we sort of shared in the research that we see the next generation of employees entering the workforce having a really strong impact in terms of ways that we want to sort of feel connected through the C-suite and the board across initiatives, and the pressure that we're willing to put on employers to sort of meet that need and that ask. And so I would say with students, that's such a rich sort of body of thinkers of their experience, first person, and how they could kind of, use their own beliefs and experiences to really sort of design the board of the future that they would like to, have being a part of the company that they're committing their time and efforts to. So it's also, academia is such a wonderful place to sort of be exploring what's possible. And I think students really kind of assigning, an opportunity to give themselves the space to think about how they might want to, what they feel like the potential for boards could be, and just the wisdom that could come from that as well. In terms of preparing them for these challenges, I think that sort of lives with sort of empowerment, right? Of how are we showing up and providing really sort of robust resources for one another, and working again in visibility and line of sight with one another, and sort of not in these sort of silos, that we are a collective. We know that Gen Z thinks more in terms of sort of we, us, rather than I, me, and kind of leaning into that sort of way of thinking and what that means for the sort of future state of both the workforce and how the workforce sort of shows up in terms of the products and services that they're developing for consumer and sort of other constituent audiences.
Great, thank you. I think it's just really staying practical and tactical. How does Edelman and Edelman Smithfield take these learnings and the kinds of findings that we've presented today and really sort of walk into that boardroom? Like, what are the practical steps that these learnings teach us to actually get that door open, and the kind of counsel that we'd like to provide once we're there, and the kind of programming that comes on the back of that? Jamie, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I love the practical tactical, and I see sort of another question that's come through that's sort of actually hinting at it, which is, is it crowdsourcing, annual brainstorming sessions, et cetera. I do think that there's just so much opportunity to really reconfigure around our design principles, meaning sort of what matters to us most in terms of how we align and inspire with our colleagues, and organize to sort of meet this sort of growing, shifting ask. In terms of sort of tactics, I think, we see more and more, if we're pulling in this sort of rich data sources, we are using the sort of analysis to divine it into insights that are sort of meaningful, and sort of acting upon it. That is a sort of end-to-end process and function that we lose the integrity of if we stop short on any one of those steps. So how are we sort of listening, hearing, integrating that information, and then having it show up in the real life day-to-day experience of our employees?
And Lex, can I turn it over to you for some final comments and anything you'd like to share before we sign off?
Definitely. Deidre, we had that one last slide. I don't know how easy it is to put that last slide back up, but in a nutshell, boards are seeking more visibility into talent, culture, workforce, and not only are they seeking visibility, they're considering their own oversight of it. If that's not a call to action for communicators, to make sure that there's a clear articulation, to make sure that it's mapped to strategy, to make sure that it's measured, to make sure that you communicators are playing a role and being a resource for boards, I don't know what is. So I think it's a really important topic at this time. And boards across the country and world are thinking more about this. So it's an important moment for our industry to step up and make sure that we have a seat at the table, and make sure that we are guiding the conversation and the trends.
Great, thank you. I for fear of disconnecting us, I didn't but we will share it. Brittany will share it around. Certainly, we love sharing our Edelman data and are happy to join classrooms and anywhere else, and boardrooms to help share and enlighten with what we believe to be true. So thank you, Brittany. I saw you on Tina. Thank you. Thank you to the IPR, and we appreciate the time and good questions from all of you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much
for taking the time to share all of this with our network. It's so valuable, and we just appreciate you all. And our attendees, thank you so much for joining and participating. All of these questions, we learn from your questions as well. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.